So Renee Corbière is with us with a program, a 2-month program we applied for called the Indigenous Undergraduate Summer Research Scholars Program. And it is all across Ontario, at least, if not Canada as well. She's from McGill, but was working with us through the end of June. So the project she's working on is our project with Fiona Kuyumjin and I to set up a public health surveillance system with the Correctional Service of Canada, that's CSC, and have them set up as a CIPSIN site. So you may have heard CIPSIN because our project Music is also a CIPSIN site. So that is, we're doing public health surveillance at federal prisons. But we also want to make sure we're doing this work right. So this project involves a lot of stakeholder engagement to make sure it's all best practices, it's meeting the needs and priorities of all the stakeholders involved. And because of the Indigenous overrepresentation in the prison system, we're doing some extra work with Indigenous communities. And Renee is going to talk a bit about that and a bit about, in general, what research work involves when you're working with Indigenous communities. And I am going to share my slide screen. Oh, just give me 1 second to get that set up. That's not to click. Okay, so you should be able to see my slides now. Okay, Renee, are you ready to get going?
Yep. Hi, so I'm Renee. Like Jessica said, I'm an Indigenous student working on a summer program here, and I've been asked to do a presentation about research involving Indigenous communities. So next slide, please. So like Jessica said, due to the over-incarceration of Indigenous people, we've decided to do a little bit of an extra forum, an engagement with Indigenous people for this research project. So right now what we've been planning is a forum with Indigenous stakeholders that we're doing as quality improvement before we do the official research, to get kind of an input on the project plan. So like we said, the reason that we felt the need to do this was the over-incarceration of Indigenous people. So while First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people comprise 3.8% of the Canadian population, they account for over 30% of the totally federally incarcerated population. And while those incarcerated already experience inadequate health care, these inequalities have been found to be even more significant for the incarcerated Indigenous population. So this presentation will just be an introduction to some of the things to consider when doing research with Indigenous peoples, and I'm going to provide some examples of how this has been considered in the current project that we're working on. So next slide. I'm going to start with the history kind of research and data in Indigenous communities and why there is a lack of trust historically. So the first researchers or people collecting data that came into Indigenous communities were the Indian agents when they came to the communities to count the number of Indians and establish reservations and group us into bands. So that started off a bad relationship basically with data collectors, and Western science since has been used to justify and sustain colonization and racist policies of subjugation. And so data collected through government agencies has been used against communities to pathologize and take action against them. For example, when it was used to extract children from their families in the residential school system and the 60s scoop. So basically for communities, through sharing personal information or community information with the government or researchers, has often led to deep communal and personal loss, which has solidified this mistrust in communities with researchers. So next slide. To go into a little bit more detail about these historical issues, one of these issues is the exclusion from the process. So this is not just in the data collection process, but Indigenous communities are often excluded from the actual interpretation and presentation of the data findings. And because of this lack of inclusion, there's often misinterpretation and pathologizing of the communities from the data that they're giving. And researchers are often failing to factor in historical traumas and Indigenous worldviews when they're analyzing the data that they collect and talking about the issues that they're seeing. And they often miss key elements that they should be collecting, or indicators that are being excluded because they're not really getting a full picture of what's going on in the community. Furthermore, the harmful use of data has also created this mistrust because many communities have been subject to studies on diabetes, HIV, and alcohol consumption, or any kind of negative statistics basically that are often focusing on individual decision making rather than community issues and presenting it as the social challenges in a broader social context. They'll be looking at kind of more problematic statistics that paint Indigenous communities in a negative light without really doing any work to benefit those communities or do anything helpful with that data. Really, it's just kind of harmful to the communities to be painting them in such a way. And then the privacy and informed consent with communities has also been a big problem with researchers because there's a lot of examples of studies on First Nations being published by research teams without the community having any approval or say in the interpretation and presentation of the findings. So communities are giving their data and not really having control over what's happening to it after. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Okay, so for data quality, I wanted to go into a little bit more depth because I was told many of you might not be working specifically with Indigenous communities or projects. So this is something I thought could be more relevant because the lack of high quality data at its initial source is one of the main issues for Indigenous research. So the main data sources like the census, the vital registration, health surveys, and surveillance systems like that would have Indigenous people included don't typically identify First Nations populations adequately, and this leads to misrepresentation of the data that we're collecting, and it limits the utility for communities and policymakers because they can't really disaggregate the data properly. So determining First Nations identity within a data set has to happen at the data collection level for it to really be useful to communities, and it has to be collected at the same time as other data for it to be most useful. Even when Indigenous identity is collected, it's also rarely disaggregated to an adequate level, which is problematic because there are differences in health determinants and health status between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and that's rarely asked on surveys and such. So next slide is some ways to address these issues. I took these suggestions or guidelines from the Alberta First Nations Information Governance Center. They have a report with data issues and solutions. So what they suggested was to develop a First Nations identifier in your research, which is essentially just a question with the data collection process that asks if the respondent is Indigenous. And then they also suggested alternative data sources, which they found had improved participation. So these are Indigenous data sources. So surveys like the Regional Health Survey, which is one that was created by the First Nations in Indigenous Governance Center, which closely aligns to the Canadian Community Health Survey, they found to have better response rates. They also suggested data linkages. So data sets that don't contain First Nations identifiers could have that info added to the data set through a process called linking. So for example, they suggest cases in a data set can be identified as First Nations by linking to the Indian Register if there's a variable in each set that is identically shared. However, it wouldn't identify non-status First Nations who are not listed in the Indian Registry. And from personal experience, I can also say that the indicators are not typically aligning to the data that is available. And I have found it very difficult to try and link data after the fact if it hasn't been collected from the beginning. But next slide. So this is also from the First Nations Information Governance Center. They've created the principles of OCAP, which are guidelines for conducting research with Indigenous communities, how to go about it respectfully in respect of their sovereignty. So the OCAP is ownership, control, access, and possession. Ownership refers to the relationship of First Nations to their cultural knowledge, data, and information. This principle states that a community or group owns information collectively in the same way that an individual owns his or her personal information. So to me, this is really talking about allowing the community to have access well, access is another point, but allowing them to be able to have this data for themselves to use. Any data that you collect from them, they should be able to have a copy of that data so that they could create reports or they could create protocols or whatever they want to do with that data. They have the ability to do that. So in our project, we've had some barriers with ownership because CSC owns the data that we are looking for, a lot of it. But we are trying to allow Indigenous communities to have input and access eventually, because we do want to respect these principles. So we are also going to kind of try and discuss with Indigenous stakeholders how we could best go about this. But control, next, C, control affirms that First Nations, their communities, and representative bodies are within their rights in seeking to control over all aspects of research and information management processes that impact them. So First Nations control of research can include all stages of a particular research project from start to finish. The principle extends to the control of resources and review processes, the planning processes, management of the information, and so on. And what's really important with control is that it's not just consultation that doesn't really have any impact on the project. Control really means that when you're consulting, when you're collaborating, I should say, with Indigenous communities during your work, you really take into meaningful account what they're saying, how they want to go about the project, what they want to use their data for, and all of that. They need to have like meaningful say in what's going on. So in our project, again, CSC is mostly in control of the data, but at the least we could help bring feedback on it. And we're also maintaining control of feedback data by having incarcerated people and external stakeholders separately when we're talking to them, so that CSC doesn't own the call data. That's because when we're doing interviews, CSC is able to access calls that we would be doing with anyone incarcerated. So we are separating calls from people who are incarcerated from those who are not, so that at least those who are not incarcerated have their privacy protected from the CSC. A for access, which refers to the fact that First Nations must have access to information and data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held. So the principle of access also refers to the right of First Nations communities and organizations to manage and make decisions regarding access to their collective information. So this may be achieved in practice through standardized formal protocols. And so in our project, our main focus is in our Indigenous forum is trying to figure out this access issue and how we can kind of make sure that we're respecting this aspect of OCAP while navigating the I guess, the bureaucratic issues surrounding getting access to this data. So it's still something we're figuring out, but what's important is just working with the communities when we're figuring out things like this, instead of just making decisions on our own. And then finally, possession. So while ownership identifies the relationship between a people and their information and principle, possession or stewardship is more concrete. It refers to the physical control of data. Possession is the mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. So again, this is another thing we'll be talking about in our forums is how will Indigenous communities have possession of the data at the end. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. In addition to OCAP, the principles of OCAP, it's really just important to maintain respectful and meaningful relationships with communities. So by prioritizing the development of respectful and trusting relationships with communities, any issue will kind of work itself out. So if data work is done in deference to self-determination, solutions will naturally present themselves and data will address community needs, support the community capacity, and further community well-being. I'm sorry. Okay. So it's the right of First Nations to construct knowledge in accordance with their self-determined definitions of what is real and what is valuable. And that really speaks to how Indigenous communities often have different priorities or goals than might be expected by non-Indigenous communities. So the data points that you're looking for, or the things that you might think are going to help, are not necessarily achieving the same things that the community wants to achieve. So Indigenous worldviews take a holistic approach to understanding well-being. And if an Indigenous worldview is not incorporated into the research activities from the outset, the findings will be incomplete and may even be unacceptable to First Nations communities, because it can almost come off as just like the historical researchers coming in and taking this information and then kind of telling Indigenous people that they know best about what to do. So it can almost create a worse relationship if you do not have those respectful relationships. Okay, next slide. So this is just another little thing with traditional and cultural customs. So honorarium is customary to give to those who share knowledge of any kind as a show of reciprocity, because reciprocity is a really important concept in Indigenous culture. But also it's very important to have elders or smudging or some other kind of ceremony, usually particularly when you're discussing difficult topics that would be like emotionally challenging for some people to talk about. It's important to have those elders as support systems. And in terms of finding an elder to work with, usually the community that you're working with would have, if you are working with a community, they would have elders in their community that they would probably want to partake, that they would help you get in contact with. But if it's a wider scale kind of research, there's a lot of, like, if you reach out to different community organizations, they can often put you in touch with an elder. There's a lot of ways you just have to go through the community and they'll help you find someone if you need that for any sort of research. Okay, so next slide. I was just going to talk a little bit more about our project and how we're doing our Indigenous engagement and everything. So we've started, like I said, doing engagement with Indigenous communities right from the formulation of the project plan. So this is, like I said, not going to be official research that we're doing right away with Indigenous communities. We're going to show them our protocol or proposal and get input right away from the beginning, if we're on the right track, if we are asking the right questions, if we're talking to the right people. And we also want to be sure to do this without burdening the communities or the people that you're talking to. You don't want to come to them with an unfinished project and just put it in their lap and basically ask them to do it for you. As much as we want to make sure they have a meaningful say in it, we want to make sure we're not just giving them a load of work to do, because a lot of different people will be coming to Indigenous communities often with projects like these asking for help. So like I said, we're including Indigenous community members in both quality improvement and official research. So after we've done the quality improvement, we will also have Indigenous stakeholders that will be involved in the official research. Hopefully we have some contacts we've reached out to already, and we're working on getting people involved with the official research while we also work on doing the quality improvement now. And then member checking is very important throughout the project implementation. So member checking is kind of taking our interpretation of the notes that we've collected from the conversations that we've had with our stakeholders, like how we've interpreted it, and showing it back to them again and making sure that we've communicated what they communicated to us effectively. So instead of just assuming that we have the right understanding of what we've heard from them, we want to really check with them that we have accurately written out what they've wanted us to communicate. And like we were discussing, we are still addressing some barriers with the CSE concerning OCAP, but again, this is something that we are hoping to speak more with communities about, on how they think we can best respect OCAP within these barriers. So next slide. Just some closing questions to leave you all with. So even if you're not explicitly working with Indigenous communities, you are still working with Indigenous people's data in your work. So these are some questions to leave you with, to think of in your own work. Are you collecting Indigenous identifiers in your work, like First Nation, Métis, Inuit, or Indigenous at all? Are you being mindful of Indigenous worldviews and cultures? And finally, how is the data you are collecting beneficial to Indigenous communities? And then we just have the references at the end if anyone wants to look through any of the sources that I was mentioning. And that's everything. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Renee, so very much for that excellent presentation. what I think we'll do is we did seek permission to record it, so that's fantastic that we have it. And when we have that posted, and perhaps along with the slides, we will let everyone know in the group where to find that. So you've given us such a great overview, as well as applying it to the projects that you're working on with Jessica and Fiona. And I think that is super helpful to us, especially pointing to those OCAP principles is really great. So thank you.